full disclosure, I've never spoken at a conference like this before, so I was just kind of trying to guess what questions you might have. But if you have any burning questions about dairy or about nutrition, please go ahead and ask them. I don't have uh, any slides that I feel like I have to get through today, but I do have a few slides. So as Dr. Page said, I just started at Utah State in August as the dairy extension specialist. Prior to that, I was teaching dairy science and animal nutrition courses at Delaware Valley University in Pennsylvania. And so as I started putting these slides together, I realized they were pretty heavy on the nutrition side of things because that's well, my specialty, and that's what I know a lot about and what I like to talk about. But if you have other questions or things you want to talk about, we can certainly try and address those. But my topics today, I thought we'd start by talking somewhat about nutrition, kind of some basics on nutrition, some things to think about, working with dairy animals, then including with that some disorders, common things that we see, particularly with dairy cows, talk about our nutrient groups, making sure we're getting all those covered. Then a little bit about milking procedure and calving, two things that are important to address as well. Raw milk. We will talk about raw milk. That's my last slide I have as well, so we'll make sure we get there. All right. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about nutrition to start with anyway. So my first kind of feeling the waters, seeing how familiar you are with, my question for you is why can cows eat grass and hay, and humans are not able to consume grass or hay? Or we don't typically eat a lot of grass and hay. Anybody brave want to answer that question? Why cows eat hay and we don't? I gotta watch my chat. That's what I thought.
I was gonna say you got stuff in the chat, Bruce.
Now I see it. All right. So 4 stomachs, interesting response. Microbes, ruminants. I don't want to get that right now. They are ruminants. They have lots of stomachs to digest. Everyone's okay. Pretty good answers. We'll go a little bit more depth and scientifically correct than that. There we go. So as we said, cows' stomachs are different than ours. So technically, cows have one stomach with 4 compartments. And the first compartment, the rumen, is a large fermentation vat. And as was mentioned in the chat, that rumen contains microbes that actually produce the enzymes that can break down the cellulose in our forages, such as hay and grass, and break down that cellulose into energy. And actually, their waste product, the volatile fatty acids, is what the cows get their energy from. We can go too much more into it than that. So that first compartment is the rumen. Then we have the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum after that. So billions of bacteria. There's actually more living organisms inside of the stomach or the rumen of a cow than there are people on the face of the planet. So there's a lot of life in there going on. And like I mentioned, they have that ability to break down the cellulose. They produce the enzyme cellulase that breaks down cellulose. You and I and any animals don't produce that enzyme that breaks down the cellulose. So when we consume food that's high in cellulose, it serves as good fiber to help keep our digestive system running normally and help keep things moving right along, which is important, but we don't get the energy out of it. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some disorders that are associated with each of the compartments in the cow's stomach. The first is the rumen. The rumen is also known as the fermentation vat. And one of the common problems we see with the rumen is, of course, rumen bloat. So I'm curious, what are some of your typical ways of treating rumen bloat, or ways that you've heard of treating it? How do you address bloat when it becomes a problem? All right, so stab with a needle. We'll talk a little bit about that. That would be your last resort. But certainly if you aren't able to get that bloat relieved before before they're going to die, then that would be your last resort. The reason I say it's your last resort is because if you stab them, then you run the risk of getting some of that rumen fluid into the intraperitoneal cavity, and then they get then that causes them a slow and painful death, whereas bloat is a fairly quick and painless death. So you haven't done them any favors at that point. Oil and sodium bicarbonate. Yeah, so really anything that you can do to release the bloat inside of that. So what happens with bloat is their gases build up. They're not able to eructate or belch out the gases in there. And you want to be able to relieve that and help them to be able to release the methane that builds up in there and get it out. Other remedies that I've heard of, stale beer, that might not be as common here in Utah as it is out in Pennsylvania. Actually, I don't know why they would ever have stale beer in Pennsylvania, but that's one of the remedies I heard from the students out there is that they use to treat bloat. Also, when I was young and we had bloated cows, we would take dish soap. We'd get a glass bottle, soda pop bottle, and fill it a quarter of the way with dish soap, then fill it the rest of the way with water, shove that to the back of their throat. And again, just trying to get them to be able to belch and get the gas out of there. Anything you can do to try and do that. And then as a last resort, you could stab them. If you are going to do that, I recommend using a trocar. So this is a trocar there. And the advantage of using a trocar over a pocket knife, for example, is that you can stab the animal and pull the needle out of the trocar, and then the tube that stays there allows for the gases to escape from the rumen and tries to keep it from going into that intraperitoneal cavity. All right. Our second compartment is the reticulum. The reticulum is also known as the honeycomb, and the reticulum is used to trap foreign bodies. But as a consequence of that, one of the things it traps often is hardware, like pieces of metal. Particularly cows are not selective in what they consume, and so they'll just stick out that tongue and bring anything into their mouth, and so you can get a wire or a nail or that. And so one of the things we do to try and prevent hardware disease or even treat it if it has happened is to feed them a magnet. And you can feed this with a pill ball gun and feed that to them. And that magnet will go down and stay in the reticulum and collect any foreign metal there in the reticulum. So this is a picture of a magnet actually that we pulled out of a cow when we did an necropsy honor out at Delaware Valley University. You can see how many metal shavings accumulated on that magnet over her lifespan. Third compartment, the oomycem. Typically, we don't see much wrong with the oomycem. Compaction is not a real common problem, but if you get a cow that gets into more mineral than they need, or if they consume sunflower seeds with the shells still on, those sunflower seed shells can get compacted inside of the oomycem. Like I said, it's not a common problem, but if it does happen, typically the best way to treat it is to go ahead and euthanize the animal, or call the butcher out and have a barbecue, because there's not really a successful treatment for compaction. Roto-Rooter doesn't work on the cows. Then our fourth stomach compartment is the abomasum, and problem that we typically see is the displaced abomasum, where that stomach will come up and flip on itself, sometimes referred to as twisted stomach. That one, fortunately, surgery is successful generally on those animals that get a displaced abomasum. Usually it turns to the left about 90% of the time. and you have some time to get it treated. If it turns to the right, then the animal will die pretty quickly unless you can get surgery done immediately on it. All right. That's just a little bit more about eructation and bloating. Let's take a second and come here to the question and answers. So, yeah, let's go ahead and talk about raw milk at this point, since it is a question that's out there. Raw milk is definitely a controversial topic. I do want to say right from the outset that it was important in the 1930s is when pasteurization of milk became almost universal. At that time period, about 30% of foodborne illness was from milk. So a third of foodborne illness came from milk. With the almost universal pasteurization of milk, that is now below 1% of foodborne illness comes from milk. So pasteurization definitely had a place and was an important technology, and has definitely prevented a lot of sickness through the history of the world. That said, we've also come a long ways in our hygiene practices on dairy farms, in our understanding of how we prevent transmission of disease. And so I'm not sure that that we'd go back if we started just drinking raw milk. I don't know if we'd go back to having 33% of our foodborne disease coming from milk. So as far as the health benefits, the raw milk people will tell you there are some, but the science has not demonstrated any health benefits of consuming raw milk or pasteurized milk. Now, you have to be careful with that, because usually if you're consuming raw milk, you are also not going to homogenize it or remove. I mean, again, depending on how you process it, if you're consuming raw milk and scraping the cream off the top, who knows what percent fat you're getting in it. If you're consuming raw whole milk that's not been pasteurized, not been homogenized, then you are going to have some more of that fat in there. And there are some of those fats that are the healthy fats, like conjugated linoleic acid has been indicated to be anti-carcinogenic. DHA is another milk fat that's helpful with brain development. Actually, in Korea, you can buy Einstein milk that's been selected to have a higher level of DHA in the milk, and it's the target for that is children that are still developing their brains. So again, the simple answer, if you're comparing the same percent fat milk, pasteurized versus unpasteurized, you're not going to see a health difference. If you're consuming whole milk, has kind of had a bad rap the last few years, and that's finally starting to turn around. People are realizing that there's different kinds of fats, and that not all fat is bad, and milk actually has some of the very healthy fats in it. And so, while I wouldn't necessarily recommend drinking raw milk, I would recommend drinking whole milk is to get those healthy fats that are in them. The next question, are you aware of any Salt Lake County backyard cow shares? I would love into buying sharing a dairy cow, but I don't know of anything in Salt Lake City. So I just moved back to Utah in August, and I am not aware of any Salt Lake City cow shares. If you want to send me an email, my email address is bruce.richards@usu.edu. If I hear of any, I'd be happy to let you know of them. But at this point, I know they're out there. So you may be aware we're doing a census of agriculture in Utah right now. It's been 5 years since it was last done. But according to the census in 2017, there were over 400 dairies in Utah, but that's any farm that has a dairy cow on it. And 200 of those 400 dairies had between 1 and 9 cows. So there's a lot of small dairies in Utah, according to that. It'll be interesting to see how that's changed over the last 5 years. But there is a lot of sharing going on. I just don't personally know those dairies yet. I'm still trying to get around the state. I got here in August, and then it was harvest season, and so that was not a good time to get out and meet people. And then it snowed, and it hasn't stopped snowing since. So anyway, I'm still working on getting to know people. The next question, did you say that ruminants produce useful energy as they break down cellulose? Any other products of note from that processing? So the microbes inside the rumen are what produce the cellulase, which is the enzyme that breaks down the cellulose. Cellulose is glucose, just like starch is. So starch, you and I and our animals produce the enzyme that breaks down starch to glucose, and we can harvest that energy. The microbes in the cow's rumen produce the cellulase that breaks down the cellulose into glucose. But they aren't doing it just to be nice to the cow or out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it for themselves. And so they actually use that glucose as their source of energy, and their waste product are what we call volatile fatty acids. The three volatile fatty acids are acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And they're what the animal can actually, the ruminant, cows being one of them, can use as their source of energy. I don't want to get too far down this road, but since you asked, it's actually interesting. And I actually had in here later. Here, I'll go to that slide real quick while I'm talking about this. So as you feed more forages to your cows, yeah, so as we look at our forage to concentrate ratio, as we feed a higher level of forage, we actually get more acetate production, which is one of those volatile fatty acids. And acetate can be used for fatty acid synthesis. So if you feed higher level of forage, you get more milk fat. And typically, if you're making cheese or doing specialty cheeses, which I imagine if you're interested in backyard dairy might be something you're doing, you're going to be interested in getting more milk fat because you can make more cheese out of it. So more forage in the diet leads to more acetate production, which leads to more milk fat production. More grain or concentrates in the diet is going to lead to more propionate production, which the cow uses as their source of energy. So the more grain you feed, the more propionate you get, the more energy the cow's going to have to produce more milk. So it is, of course, a balancing act, like most things in life, balancing that forage to concentrate ratio. We can talk more about that if you want, but just a little bit about that. So the volatile fatty acids are the products that are produced from the rumen microbes that the cow actually uses for energy. 70% of their energy is from those volatile fatty acids. The next question, do cows or cattle pass ingested macronutrients or is surgery necessary to remove them? So they just stay there in the reticulum and they stay there for the rest of the cow's life. They don't break down, they don't pass on further down the digestive tract. The magnet stays there and holds the wire there. And one reason why that's important is because the reticulum, which is that second stomach compartment, it sits in front of the rumen, but it sits right next to the heart. And so what will happen is that nail or that wire will start to penetrate the reticulum, and if it punctures the heart, then the cow dies pretty quickly. But even just starting to penetrate that reticulum will cause her to go off feed. She'll stop eating. She'll start to look dull and listless and unhealthy because that's irritating her, causing an irritation. And so by feeding that magnet, it holds it there. And like I say, it just stays there the rest of the cow's life. If you're really worried about money and don't want to buy more magnets, you can pull them out after the cow dies and clean them up and reuse them. I'm not aware of a lot of people that do that, but it can be done. All right. Yes, update on our questions. I think so. All right, so let's talk some more about feed for that. So our 6 nutrient groups that we that's part of nutrition. So a nutrient is something that is essential to support life that is found in feed or food. these nutrients, the most important is actually water. You may be aware, you can live for 2 or 3 weeks, and your animals can live for 2 or 3 weeks without food. I'm not saying I recommend it, but they can live for 2 to 3 weeks without food. They can only live for 2 or 3 days without water. So make sure they have water. I've heard way too many stories of people forgetting to turn the water on, or having somebody take care of the cows over the weekend that forgets to water them, or whatever. But it happens way too often when for whatever reason they don't get watered and they die. I've heard way too many stories about that happening. So make sure they have plenty of water. Energy comes from 3 of our nutrients, from carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these. Of course, we don't usually, when we're looking at a ration for a dairy cow, we don't balance the ration just for carbohydrates. We balance it for fiber and energy. That fiber is important. As I mentioned, the rumen microbes can break down that fiber into energy, but it also, that fiber helps keep the digestive tract, especially the rumen, healthy. You want to form what we call rumen mat, and fiber is very important for forming that rumen mat. And then we look at energy, typically feeding concentrate, some type of energy. Typically here in Utah, that would be corn that you're feeding. How about you could feed other things as well? Wheat would be a really good feed if you can, and the way corn's getting more expensive, wheat might become more affordable. But typically, historically, wheat's just been too expensive to feed as a source of energy. Then protein. We'll talk a little bit more about protein here in a minute, and fat, of course, provides energy. Then we have our minerals and vitamins. You see there listed some minerals that are typically going to be included in a dairy diet. The ones that are bold are ones that are typically deficient in soils in Utah, and so they're going to be of extra importance to make sure that we're getting enough of them in the diet. Vitamins. So vitamins A, D, and E are ones that we typically supplement in dairy diets. We usually just feed them the requirement because it's expensive to test feeds for the levels that are provided in the feed, and it's not expensive to just supplement them in the diet. Those rumen microbes will synthesize the B vitamins, and we'll talk a little bit. Well, we may run out of time, but some of the B vitamins the cows will benefit, especially if they're in a high stress producing a lot of milk. They'll benefit from supplementation, but generally the rumen microbes can produce enough of the B vitamins and vitamin K to meet their requirement. And vitamin C, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. So vitamin C, the humans and guinea pigs are about the only species, and some fruit bats that require vitamin C in the diet. Most livestock can synthesize, including dairy cows, most livestock can synthesize vitamin C from glucose. Humans, we lack the enzyme to do that. So interesting there. We're getting short on time, so I won't spend too much time on water, but one thing to point out with water is that their drinking water is not their only source of water. Usually they're going to get water from feed as well. And then there's a little bit of what we call metabolic water, which results as carbohydrates are broken down, you get metabolic water. More about that another day if you are interested. Some things to think about with water that are going to affect their requirements include dry matter intake. So how much feed they're consuming is going to affect how much water they need, the amount of water in the feed, as I just mentioned. Of course, if temperature is going to affect it, the type of productive function and the sodium levels. All of these things are things that affect it, their water requirements. So for a backyard dairy, my assumption is that you're not going to be pushing your animals for the top level of milk production, which is just fine. As I mentioned, if you feed a higher forage diet, you're going to get more milk fat. So generally in dairy rations, we range the forage to concentrate ratio is between 40 and 60%. And the funny thing is that it works both ways. So you could have 40% forage, 60% concentrate, or 40% concentrate, 60% forage. You kind of have a range there for each of those. And so, like I said, that forage can help form that rumen mat. It's important for that. But the more concentrate you feed, the more energy the cow is going to have to produce milk. All right, my evaluation's coming up already. So let's I'll try and cover a couple more things real quick. I started late, so I don't feel bad taking a couple more minutes over. Hopefully I don't get in too much trouble. Make sure you process your corn if you are feeding corn. If you're feeding whole corn, then a lot of that corn is going to end up in the manure, and then you just have expensive manure, and nobody likes expensive manure. So whether you grind it, whether you crack it, and just make sure you rupture that corn kernel so the microbes can get in there and break down that corn further and digest it. The other thing the rumen microbes can synthesize is the amino acids. So there's 10 essential amino acids. And again, a cow that's not in a high stress situation is likely going to be okay, as long as you're providing enough nitrogen and energy. So you can feed some lower quality proteins like soybean meal or other proteins, and cows can take that source of nitrogen, and if you're feeding a similar level of energy, they can synthesize microbial protein, and that's a very nice amino acid profile that you get from the microbial protein, and get their protein requirements that way. Under stressful situations, dairy cows have been shown to benefit from supplementing lysine and methionine in the diet. And so that might be something to consider, but probably in a backyard dairy situation, that's not something you're going to have to worry about. Let's see here. Fat, usually you're just going to feed fat in the diet. If you need to help get your energy levels up, typical diets are going to provide all of the essential fatty acids to the cows. Just flip through these real quick. Here's a, sorry, let's get around here. Sorry about that. Typical mineral profile you can see there, amount in milligrams per day of some of our trace minerals. We'll flip through this. If you have questions, my contact information is at the end, and we can talk more about these later on. Here's our typical, so vitamins are measured in international units, and that's going to be looking at the activity level of the vitamin. That's why they're measured differently than minerals. You can see typical international units per pound for vitamins A, D, and E there. Here's some explanation of what the vitamins do. I think we might leave it there. Like I say, another day we can talk some more about some of these other things. But there's my contact information, my email, and phone number, office number. I'm also on. We have a dairy extension page on USU Extension Dairy. If you want to follow us on Facebook, and if there's any more questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, Dr. Richards. Thank you very much. Very informative. We'll see if we have any questions. I know you answered a handful of them as you went through some of your slides and stuff. So as of now, I'm not seeing any. But like Dr. Richards said, any of you that are interested in milk production or cheeses or really anything to do with dairy, Dr. Richards is a great guy to talk to. Especially when it comes to your biggest input, which is nutrition and feed costs. And so I just urge you to all do that. we did have one question pop in. We'll take this one, and then we'll probably, where did the question go?
Here it says
Um,
about the Buttergate in Canada feeding coconut milk. I'm not sure exactly what they're asking there. I haven't heard of Buttergate. Is that
Huh.
like Buttergate?
I think it's Buttergate is that they were saying that the butter was harder. So like at room temperature, it used to be softer. And in Canada, there was this thing going around that they said their butter was harder, but I'm not sure completely what the science behind that was and if that was
Huh.
proven or not.
Yeah, so depending on your fatty acid makeup of your butter, if you're feeding something different, well, okay, let me back up. So if your makeup of your butter is made up of something different than a typical butter is made up of, you could definitely change how hard your butter is, because different fatty acids have different melting points at which they'll melt. And coconuts, I believe coconut coconut oil tends to be more saturated, which means it would be harder. But that would also have some negative health benefits too, I would think. So yeah, you could definitely affect your hardness. As far as if you're asking about feeding your animals coconut oil and that affecting the milk, that's not going to happen because your fatty acids are changed in the rumen anyway. And so, so going back to a little bit to your fats, your monogastrics, like your pigs, if you feed them unsaturated fatty acids, then their body fat's going to be made up of unsaturated fatty acids. Your ruminants, like cows, if you feed them unsaturated fatty acids, they're going to become saturated in the rumen because the rumen microbes take unsaturated fatty acids and saturate them. And so ruminants are typically going to just have saturated fatty acids in their body. And so I'm not sure if that's what your question was, if you're referring specifically to what you put in the butter or what you're feeding the cows, but the cows, the rumen microbes will convert unsaturated fatty acids into saturated fatty acids unless you feed rumen protected fatty acids, which there are some of the essential fatty acids that we do feed as rumen protected because otherwise the rumen microbes will saturate them and not deliver them to the intestine for absorption. That's probably more than you wanted to know.
No, I think it's well taken either way.